We act out things we don't understand all the time. And if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't need a psychology or a sociology or an anthropology or any of that, because we would be completely transparent to ourselves. And we're clearly not. So we're much more complicated than we understand, which means that the way that we behave contains way more information than we know. And part of the dream that surrounds our articulated knowledge has been extracted as a consequence of us watching each other behave and telling stories about it for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, extracting out patterns of behavior that characterize humanity and trying to represent them partly through imitation, but also through drama and mythology and literature and art and all of that, to represent what we're like so that we can understand what we're like. And that process of understanding is what I see unfolding, at least in part, in the biblical stories. And it's halting and partial and awkward and contradictory and all of that, which is one of the things that makes the book so complex. But I see in it the struggle of humanity to rise above its animal forebears, say, and to become conscious of what it means to be human. And that's a very difficult thing, because we don't know who we are, what we are, where we came from, or any of those things. And, you know, the life is an unbroken chain going back 3.5 billion years. It's an absolutely unbelievable thing. Every single one of your ancestors reproduced successfully for 3.5 billion years. It's absolutely unbelievable. We rose out of the dirt and the muck, and here we are, conscious but not knowing. And we're trying to figure out who we are. And a story that we've been telling, or a set of stories that we've been telling for 3,000 years, seems to me to have something to offer. And so when I look at the stories in the Bible, I do it, I would say, in some sense, with a beginner's mind. It's a mystery, this book, how the hell it was made, why we preserved it, how it happened to motivate an entire culture for 2,000 years and to transform the world. Like, what's going on? How did that happen? It's by no means obvious. And one of the things that bothers me about casual critics of religion is that they don't take the phenomena seriously. And it's a serious phenomena. I mean, not least because people have the capacity for religious experience, and no one knows why that is. And I mean, you can induce it reliably in all sorts of different ways. You can do it with brain stimulation. You can certainly do it with drugs. There's especially the psychedelic variety. They produce intimations of the divine extraordinarily regularly. People have been using drugs like that for God only knows how long, 50,000 years, maybe more than that, to produce some sort of intimate union with the divine. It's like, we don't understand any of that. When we discovered the psychedelics in the late 60s, it shocked everybody so badly that they were instantly made illegal and abandoned in terms of research for like 50 years. And it's no wonder, because who the hell expected that? Nobody. Now Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, you see, and he was also, I would say, a very astute critic of Nietzsche. He was educated by Freud. And Freud, I suppose, in some sense, started to collate the information that we had pertaining to the notion that people lived inside a dream. You know, it was Freud who really popularized the idea of the unconscious mind. And we take this for granted to such a degree today that we don't understand how revolutionary the idea was. Like what's happened with Freud is that we've taken all the marrow out of his bones, so to speak, and left the husk behind. And you know, now when we think about Freud, we just think about the husk, because that's everything that's been discarded. But so much of what he discovered is part of our popular conception now, including the idea that your perceptions and your actions and your thoughts are all, what would you say, informed and shaped by unconscious motivations that are not part of your voluntary control. And that's a very, very strange thing. It's one of the most unsettling things about the psychoanalytic theories, because the psychoanalytic theories are something like, you're a loose collection of living sub-personalities, each with its own set of motivations and perceptions and emotions and rationales, all of that. And you have limited control over that. So you're like a plurality of internal personalities that's loosely linked into a unity. You know that because you can't control yourself very well, which is one of Jung's objections to Nietzsche's idea that we could create our own values. See, Jung didn't believe that, especially not after interacting with Freud, because he saw that human beings were affected by things that were deeply, deeply affected by things that were beyond their conscious control. And no one really knows how to conceptualize those things. You know, the cognitive psychologists think about them in some sense as computational machines. And the ancient people, I think, thought of them as gods, although it's more complex than that. Like rage would be a god. Mars, the god of rage, that's the thing that possesses you when you're angry. You know, it has a viewpoint and it says what it wants to say, and that might have very little to do with what you want to say when you're being sensible. And it doesn't just inhabit you, it inhabits everyone, and it lives forever, and it even inhabits animals. And so it's this transcendent psychological entity that inhabits the body politic like a thought inhabits the brain. That's one way of thinking about it. It's a very strange way of thinking, but it certainly has its merits. And those things, well, in some sense, those are deities, although it's not that simple. And so Jung got very interested in dreams and started to understand the relationship between dreams and myths, because he would see in his clients' dreams echoes of stories that he knew because he was deeply read in mythology. And then he started to believe that the dream was the birthplace of the myth, and that there was a continual interaction between the two processes, the dream and the story, and storytelling. And, well, you know, you tend to tell your dreams as stories when you remember them. And some people remember dreams all the time, like 2 or 3 a night. I've had clients like that, and they often have archetypal dreams that have very clear mythological structures. I think that's more the case with people who are creative, by the way, especially if they're a bit unstable at the time, because the dream tends to occupy the space of uncertainty and to concentrate on fleshing out the unknown reality before you get a real grip on it. So it's like the dream is the birthplace of thinking. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so because it's the birthplace of thinking, it's not that clear. It's doing its best to formulate something. That was Jung's notion, as opposed to Freud, who believed that there were sensors, internal sensors, that were hiding the dream's true message. That's not what Jung believed. He believed the dream was doing its best to express a reality that was still outside of fully articulated conscious comprehension. It was, because you think, look, a thought appears in your head, right? That's obvious. Bang, it's nothing you ever ask about. But what the hell does that mean? A thought appears in your head. What kind of ridiculous explanation is that? You know, it just doesn't help with anything. Where does it come from? Well, nowhere. It just appears in my head. Okay, well, that's not a very sophisticated explanation, as it turns out, you know? And so you might think that those thoughts that you think, well, where do they come from? Well, they're often someone else's thoughts, right? Someone long dead, that might be part of it, just like the words you use to think are utterances of people who've been long dead. And so you're informed by the spirit of your ancestors. That's one way of looking at it. And your motivations speak to you, and your emotions speak to you, and your body speaks to you. And it all does all that, at least in part, through the dream. And the dream is the birthplace of the fully articulated idea. They don't just come from nowhere fully fledged, right? They have a developmental origin, and God only knows how lengthy that origin is. Even to say something like, I am conscious, you know, that's taken... Chimpanzees don't say that. You know, it's been 7 million years since we broke from chimpanzees, something like that from the common ancestor. You know, they have no articulated knowledge at all. They have very little self-representation in some sense, and very little self-consciousness. And that's not the case with us at all. And we had to painstakingly figure all of this out during that, you know, 7 million year voyage. And I think some of that's represented and captured in some sense in these ancient stories, which I believe were part of, especially the oldest stories in Genesis, which is the stories we're going to start with, that some of the archaic nature of the human being is encapsulated in those stories, and it's very, very instructive as far as I can tell. So Jung believed that the dream was the birthplace of thought, and I've been extending that idea because one of the things I wondered about deeply was, you know, you have a dream and then someone interprets it, and you can argue about whether or not an interpretation is valid, just like you can argue about whether your interpretation of a novel or movie is valid, right? It's a very difficult thing to determine with any degree of accuracy, which counts in part for the postmodern critique. But my observation has been that people will present a dream, and sometimes we can extract out real useful information from it that the person didn't appear to know. You know, and they get a flash of insight, and to me that's a marker that we've stumbled on something that unites part of that person that wasn't united before. It pulls things together, which is often what a good story will do, or sometimes a good theory. You know, things snap together for you, and there's a little light goes on, and that's one of the markers that I've used for accuracy in dreams. And I know in my own family, when I was first married, you know, I'd have fights with my wife, arguments about this and that, and I'm fairly hot-headed, and so I'd get all puffed up and, you know, agitated about whatever we were arguing about, and she'd go to sleep, which was really annoying, you know, so annoying. Because I couldn't sleep, right? I was like chewing off my fingernails, and she'd be like sleeping peacefully beside me. It's like maddening. So, but often she'd have a dream, you know, and then the next morning she'd discuss it with me, and then we could unravel what was at the bottom of our argument. And that was unbelievably useful, even though it was extraordinarily aggravating. He wrote these books, notebooks that haven't been published yet, called the Black Books. And the Black Books are the documentation of his experiments with his imagination. And what he would do is daydream, like a child daydreams. He regained that faculty, although I think with Jung it was a faculty that had never really disappeared. And he had figures of imagination that came to him that he could speak with. And he spoke with these figures of imagination and documented that over a very long period of time. And that was eventually distilled into a book called The Red Book, which was published about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a book that Jung regarded as the central source from which all his inspiration emerged. It was sort of, the way it looks to me is that we embody a lot of information in our action, right? And our action has developed as a consequence of imitating other people. And not only the people around us, but of course the people around us imitated the people who came before them, and those people imitated the people who came before them, and so on, so far back that it's as far back as you can go. And so you embody these patterns of behavior that are extremely informative, that you don't understand, that are a consequence of collective imitation across the centuries. And so then those patterns can become manifest as figures of the imagination. And those figures of imagination are the distillations of patterns of behavior. And so, as the distillations of patterns of behavior, they have content. And it's not you, that content. You could even think about it as content that's evolved, although it's culturally transmitted. It's content that's evolved. And so these figures of the imagination can reveal the structure of reality to you. And that's what happened with Jung. And that's what he described in the Red Book. And that was what permeated his psychology, a psychology that was based on the presupposition that the fundamental archetypal structures of religious belief were not pathological, not deceitful, not protective in some delusional sense against the fear of death, but quite the contrary. The very stories that enabled us to move forward as confident human beings in the face of chaos itself. And it's conceivable, I think perhaps probable, that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that. Because it was the first time post-Enlightenment that a rapprochement between the intellect and the underlying religious archetypal substructure occurred. You have in the capacious intellect of Jung, and the same thing happened to some degree with Piaget, the religious domain and the factual domain were brought back together. And the fact of Jung's enduring and increasing popularity and influence, I would say, is a direct consequence of that. Now, some of his work was spun off into the New Age, and the New Age is a very optimistic and naive movement. It's predicated on the idea that you can do nothing, say, but follow your bliss, and that will take you ever higher to enlightenment, and that's not the Jungian idea at all. The Jungian idea is that what you most need will be found where you least want to look. So there's this story, King Arthur. There's this story of King Arthur,
They're all in a round table, right? King Arthur and his knights, they're all equals. They're all superordinate, but they're all equals. And they go off to look for the Holy Grail. But they don't know where to look. So where do you look when you don't know where to look? For something you need desperately, but have lost. Well, each of the knights goes into the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's Jungian psychoanalysis in a nutshell. It's like that which you fear and avoid, that which you hold in contempt, that which disgusts you and that you avoid. That's the gateway to what you need to know. There's nothing New Age about that. That's for sure.